Well, good morning and welcome on a beautiful Wednesday morning. We're so glad you could join us today. My name is Adam White. I'm the director of the C. Boyd & Gray Center for the Study of the Administrative State. And it's my great honor and pleasure to welcome you all here today for a discussion of civil service. We decided to do this event to mark the one-year anniversary of three significant executive orders issued by President Trump last year. The orders in and of themselves are interesting and important, but the topic, the broader topic of civil service and its relationship to democratic governance, we thought, is timeless and important and deserved a conference. In fact, I should add, next year we'll be commissioning an entire year's worth of research and scholarship on some of these issues and reconvening a year from now for a similar discussion. So we're so glad to begin the process today with these speakers and these topics. I will say one person who wanted to join us today but was unavailable is Stuart Eisenstadt, a veteran of the Carter and Clinton administrations. He obviously knows these issues very well and has given them a lot of thought. He wanted to join us, but he couldn't. But he penned for us a brief paper reflecting on civil service in the Carter administration. Copies of it are available here, as well as copies of Don Devine's own fine paper. So please take a copy with you. It's also available right now on our homepage. And in addition to that, Mr. Eisenstadt has kindly provided us copies of his book reflecting on the Carter administration and governance under President Carter. We have free copies available on the back table, so please be sure to take a copy with you today. Without any further ado, let me turn it over to the Center's Deputy Director, Andrew Closter, who will be leading the first discussion this morning. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Adam, and thank you all for being here. So this panel, you may remember, first of all, the government-wide shutdown that sort of ended earlier this year. You might already have forgotten. What you probably don't remember is what ended the government shutdown, or what appears to have ended the government shutdown, which is the slowdown and then partial shutdown by the FAA of LaGuardia International Airport. So why is that important? Well, because the reason for the shutdown was of LaGuardia was because there were not enough air traffic controllers that were available. And part of the reason for that is because there are a thicket of collective bargaining agreements with NATCA, the follow-on to PATCO, that limit how and when people can be air traffic controllers can go on watch, and maybe the math doesn't add up, and the next thing you know, due to safety regulations requiring folks to come off duty when they've been on duty for a certain amount of time, next thing you know, there aren't enough air traffic controllers. So, and all of that has to do with collective bargaining negotiation and the authority of the FAA, DOT, and the executive branch to manage its personnel. So gone are the days of PATCO. So thank you all for coming. We're here at the C. Boyd & Gray Center for the Study of the Administrative State. As Adam is wont to mention, it is the Center for the Study of the Administrative State rather than the Center for the Study of Administrative Law. And in this context, today's conference will really take a look at not doctrines of administrative law, but issues of management and implementation, particularly with respect to labor and the civil service. So with us today for this kickoff panel on civil service and perspective are three real experts, policy folks that have been at the forefront of conceiving of ideas and of implementing ideas in administrations of both parties for decades. So I'm very pleased to have these three panelists with me. I think I will introduce all three panelists right now. We will have them speak in chronological order. I think that makes some sense. So our first speaker will be Donald J. Devine. He's the Grucock Senior Scholar at the Fund for American Studies here in Washington, D.C. He served as President Reagan's Civil Service Director during the president's first term in office. So I mentioned PATCO. We may get some comments on that subject or on other subjects from Don. He's a columnist, and he appears regularly in the American Spectator, Newsmax, The Imaginative Conservative, and the Library of Law and Liberty. And he is the author of 9 books, including the most recent, America's Way Back, Reclaiming Freedom, Tradition, and Constitution. Don relatively recently, at the end of last year, authored this backgrounder for the Heritage Foundation, which we've made available with printouts at the back for you as well. The paper's title is Reforming the Federal Bureaucracy, Challenge and Opportunity. In addition, as Adam mentioned, there are copies of Stuart Eisenstadt's short paper and his book on Carter. Our second panelist will be Elaine C. Kmark. She's the founding director for the Center for Effective Public Management, and she's a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution. She's an expert on American electoral politics and government innovation and reform. And she was germane to this panel. In the 1980s, she was one of the founders of the New Democrat movement, which helped Bill Clinton get elected, and she served in the White House from 1993 to 1997, where she created and managed the Clinton administration's National Performance Review, also known as the Reinventing Government Initiative. And then finally, our last panelist is George Nesterchuk. He's the president of Nesterchuk and Associates. He has quite a lengthy track record as a civil servant in various branches of government. He has over 40 years. From 2004 to 2006, he was the senior advisor to the director at OPM. Senior advisor to the director of OPM for the Department of Defense. And he, from 1995 to 2000, was the staff director for the subcommittee on civil service of the Committee on Government Reform in the U.S. House of Representatives. So thank you all for coming. I look very much forward to your comments to help set the stage for today's conference. And Don, if you would.
Right, thank you. It's nice to be here. You've got to be somewhere. And very beautiful place, actually. As I said, my name is Donald Devine. I'm a kind of reformed political scientist who ran into a guy named Ronald Reagan that kind of changed my life. And I worked for him in his campaign, and he called up and he said, Don, I got a job. I said, what is it? Director of the Office of Personnel Management. I said, Office of Personnel Management, that's the head of the bureaucracy. That's kind of a funny job to give a libertarian conservative like me. And he said, well, I have a good sense of humor. I said, well, what do you want me to do? He said, I want you to cut back 100,000 non-defense employees. I want you to reduce their bloated benefits, and I want you to make them work harder. I said, thanks a lot, going to make a lot of friends in this job. We did it, and I didn't make any friends. But it was a great experience, and I'm going to take my job, since nobody knows very much about the civil service. I'm going to give you a history of the civil service in 5 or 6 minutes. So that's not too much time to spend on history, even of kind of the civil service. You'll see on the board now, these are the principles of the civil service. They go back to 1883, although it's a little clumsy there. In 1970, they put down the specific principles in another law. The first one's recruiting, selecting, and advance employees based on their relative ability, knowledge, and skills. Well, that's kind of in a problem today. The second is adequate compensation. Well, that's good. That's really ahead of the game. They make more than the private sector. Third, training employees. I don't know how that's going these days. Retaining employees on the basis of the adequacy of their performance. Got some problems there. Fair treatment of all applicants on political affiliation, race. Well, I don't know about political. As a matter of fact, about 80% vote Democrat. And assuring employees are protected against coercion. They do a pretty good job on that. So those are the principles, and George and Elaine will talk more about them, I'm sure. Now, why isn't this moving? All right. This doesn't work. All right. There it goes. All right. The next most important thing about starting the civil service is a guy who had something to do with starting the civil service. But he wrote a book about the science of administration with an article in 1887, and he wanted to fix a fatal flaw of the government system, something he called the Constitution. Kind of got in the way of the bureaucracy because the Congress was so much involved in running the government, even with the career civil service, and you can forget about all that junk around. That's from another lecture I do. But he wanted to fix this fatal flaw in the Constitution that we thought it would be run on political principles. He wanted to have the best career experts who were going to run the administration and not have to be subject to all the foibles of Congress. He wrote a book on congressional government saying how bad it was and how we had to replace it with real experts like they did in Europe. It's so far ahead of us. Prussia was such an impressive government, and they got things done. You know, they even had a Social Security system, a whole welfare state. Probably the most important intellectual, his name's Woodrow Wilson, if you haven't caught it, was president of Princeton University, governor of New Jersey, president of the United States, and changed American government to talk about having experts rather than political people running the government. Now, why isn't this? What do you took to change this thing? Huh?
They'll change it.
All right. All right, now we come to today and kind of the experts. 99.6% of the experts are rated as fully successful or above in the government. 60% exceed fully successful, only 0.3 minimally successful, and 0.1% are unsuccessful. What's the kind of reaction of people? Well, the head of the half-sheet union said, well, if agencies hire the best people, where's the problem? All right, they only hire the best, so why shouldn't they all be rated highly? William Duggan, NFFE, another one of the unions, he's a little more, he says, well, maybe they're a little high. The head of the Senior Executive Association, not the one coming here, at the time of the Veterans Administration scandal, they gave big bonuses to all the people involved in the problems at the VA. And he says, well, they all deserve bonuses. They're outstanding people. They wouldn't be in the senior executive service if they weren't outstanding people. All right, that's kind of where we were. Next one, I guess you're going to have to do it. What is going on? All right, here. When Jimmy Carter ran for president, the government was in big problems. Here's a guy, he was, nobody ever heard of him. He was governor of New Jersey, of Georgia. Jersey was the other guy, Wilson. All right, he's from Georgia. He comes in the race for president. He doesn't even rate 1% support. But he has a message that none of the others, all the others talk about programs and what we can do. And he said, listen, I agree with all you guys on the program. The problem is that the bureaucracy doesn't work. None of these programs are actually performed correctly. And what we need to do is to reform the bureaucracy. And he runs that. He gets the Democratic nomination. He wins the presidential election based on that. And unlike most politicians, he actually did what he said he was going to do. He changed the civil service. He looked at those numbers that everybody's getting perfect scores and said, this is ridiculous. You need to have a correct evaluation of them. You got to make them, pay them based on how well they work. You got to make this an efficient run organization. Let's see. No, nothing. All right. But he didn't know very much about public administration, so he brought in a genius, a political genius, who actually was my professor at Syracuse University. He taught me public administration. Like Carter, a Democrat, very active in the Democratic Party. We had all kinds of arguments when I was in his class. But he reached out to this guy. His name is William, we call him Scotty Campbell was his nickname. And Carter brought him in to reform the civil service. Now, the only thing, and reading Eisenstadt's little note there, I'm not sure he really understood what Campbell did. Because Campbell, as all of us in the graduate area in Syracuse University, where he taught, we were against the old public administration, and we believed that the only thing correct was to run the bureaucracy on democratic principles. That the people should be in charge of the government, not experts from outside. So he came in and he reformed the civil service based on political principles to give the political leadership in the agencies, the secretary, assistant secretary, even created a formal political group of senior executives, non-career senior executives, put in a good performance appraisal system. Getting through Congress, he had to make a lot of agreements, and he had to add a whole labor relations system, which was not in it. But anyway, they got it passed. A very significant change, really the first major change in the civil service in 100 years. He got it passed, and it became law. Now the problem is, poor Scotty worked for 2 years to put this all in operation, but Carter lost the next election. So here I come in, Reagan appoints me. I walk in there and the whole civil service is fixed up for me, all right? I didn't have to do a thing, all right? The only thing I had to do is everybody tried to stop it from going into effect, didn't actually go into effect under me. And of course the unions and everybody saying, oh, this is the end of the world, or take away everything from us. So my biggest fight was to keep it from going into effect, stop it in Congress, stop it even in our own White House. They were all saying, let it stop. We don't want to have all these fights over civil service. Who cares about it? All right. So anyway, we fought, and it did go into effect. And I just kind of turned the key and had all these new advantages that nobody else had. How about next? this is what I walked into, all right? All right, this is the bureaucracy. It's an amazingly complicated thing, and you're standing up at the top, and there's all this stuff going on down below you that you don't know very much about. All right, what's the next one? All right, you can't read that, it looks like, but there's a lot of what one of the experts in the field called dark matter that goes on within this bureaucratic area that aren't laws. Well, first we have executive orders. We know what they are, all right? The president can do them by themselves, and he's supposed to follow the direction of the experts, like in the Office of Management and Budget, to do things that Congress doesn't want the president to do. Now, of course, executive orders really don't mean anything. What an executive order is, in fact, it says, please, Mr. Secretary or Mrs. Secretary, will you please do this, all right? The president doesn't do anything in an executive order. He gives it to the agency. Well, the agency head, the secretary, doesn't know what to do with this stupid thing. So he gives it to the assistant secretary, deputy assistant secretary, the director, the subdirector, and it gets kind of lost through the process there. All right, the second thing is Federal Register rulings, all right? The bureaucracy can make up the laws themselves. Congress says, hey, do something good about taking care of children, all right? But then it goes into the bureaucracy, and they write what is the real law. All right, next, agency memoranda, send them around. Everybody follows what they are. There are guidance documents that have no legal standing, except when courts can't find anything to find in the law, they'll pick one of them and use them for precedent. Notices, bulletins, directives, news releases. I had news releases used against me in courts that I sent out. Letters, blog posts, emails, oral statements. All of these are things that go on there that nobody sees very much of. Come to a conclusion. And Elaine's institution, Brookings Institution, a guy named Paul Light, he's actually, I think at the last time I heard him was at New York University, a top public administration guy in the country, has done many reports for Congress, everybody. What is he? He's no conservative, no Republican. By the way, everybody I've been talking about who's great people are Democrats, all right? All right? All right. What does he say? Today, we cannot faithfully execute, using the term in the Constitution itself, we cannot faithfully execute the laws of the United States. He says 60 layers, I think it's less, but let's accept him. There's 60 layers between when you make a decision and when you have to carry it out. You can't do it, all right? And they do too many things. They try to do everything. All right, to me, he's a conservative. Now, he's a progressive. He'd be insulted if he did that. But the point is, any serious person, in my opinion, can look at this bureaucracy cannot do what it tries to do. It tries to do everything. All right. So Reagan appoints me to come in. And what does he say about running government? He says something that shocks conservatives. He says, I'm not cutting taxes to save money. All right? He said, I'm cutting taxes at the federal level so we can force things down to states and local governments where most of this stuff should be done. That's the first reason to do it. The second reason is if we give the feds less to do, it will work. Well, as I told you, he kind of gave me a very simple, what is going on here? Next one. All right. Every time I was in the cabinet room giving a presentation trying to keep everybody on board, and that is me, even though it's dark hair, that's definitely me. All right. Every time he would send me in there to read the riot act to the agency heads, and I would insult them. Right, that chart up there. Each agency that these guys are in charge of, I'm telling them how many people they're adding back. We did cut the 100,000. What do they all want to add them back? We got to have more bureaucrats to do the job. All right. We had a great time. We actually, I think, made it work for a while. All right, what do I think today? I'm not going to go through this. Another Democrat, Aaron Wildowski, tells us what we have to do. We have to get back to, I'm almost finished. We got to get back to running the government on democratic principles rather than on principle. He, in fact, endorsed my book on how to get politics administration. All right, and one more. Just give me one more click here. All right, this is the last one. All right. There is a different principle of public administration than the principle that basically has been carried on from Woodrow Wilson by a guy named Ostrom. I don't know if Ostrom's a Democrat or a Republican, but everybody else I'm resting my case on is a Democrat. We need to reverse this Wilsonian idea that you can throw everything over to one centralized bureaucracy and we can solve all the world's program, and return to what Ronald Reagan said made America great, which is federalism. Executive branch should be based on democracy, putting the people in charge through the people they elect. Congress should make laws rather than having the bureaucracy make them and do real oversight. Courts should be neutral between the branches. I can follow up on that, and follow the 10th Amendment. Thanks.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about a topic that was very close to me at one point, although I've veered away from it recently. First of all, I want to tell you that in between working as the senior advisor to the president for reinventing government many years ago, I went to Harvard, to the Kennedy School to teach government, and I did some consulting in those years. I ended up consulting in 35 countries, either with their governments or with their prime ministers or teaching their civil servants, their executives. And basically what it did was left me with great admiration for the American government that I had so roundly criticized and tried to reform. So somehow the air has gone out of the balloon here when I think of all the experiences I've had since my White House days, where I've been in countries where in the public hospitals you had to actually pay the nurses to take care of your aging mother or father, because they wouldn't do it as a matter of doing their job. I mean, the extent of corruption, anti-professionalism, et cetera, in most developing countries in the world is so staggering that frankly, when you come home and you look at our civil service, you say, oh, phew. All the problems that Don rightly pointed out, boy, oh boy, do they look minor compared to what I have seen around the world. So let me start with that, and let me then go to my experience in the Carter administration with particularly civil service, and then a couple thoughts for today's world. One of the things that we did that was most useful was, and it was of course because we were a Democratic administration, is that we became partners with the big federal unions. And we established a National Partnership Council, and we tried to work through with them all the issues. We did this not just because we were Democrats and therefore, friendly to unions, but we also did this because when we consulted CEOs of major corporations around the country and around the world about do-overs and makeovers, they all told us one thing: if you don't have the bureaucrats or the frontline workers on your side, you will fail. And these were people who are not particularly, definitely not Democrats. They weren't friendly to unions, but they basically had some real world experience in corporate successes and corporate turnarounds. And they said, if your workers aren't with you, forget it. It's not going to happen. So that was the first thing we did. We ended up cutting more than 250,000 people out of the federal government in the course of the Clinton administration. Many of those were the Cold War downsizing, but in fact, the proportions by other parts of the government were equal to the proportions that came out of the national security piece of the government, which, as you know, because the Pentagon is the 800-pound gorilla, that's very, very big. But the cuts were all across the board. How did we do it? Well, we had two things going for us: a very robust economy. We got buyouts for the first time in the federal government, so we were able to offer people buyouts and early retirement. And especially what we had was, that we were just lucky in, was we had the advent of the information technology revolution. When I went to the White House in 1993, we had no computers and those push-button phones. Some of you in the room will remember those big plastic buttons on the phones. That was what we had. By 1996, we were on the internet, although the Secret Service was still really, really paranoid about us using the internet. We weren't allowed to put the president's schedule on it or talk about the president's schedule. So in other words, what was happening in the first term, particularly of the Clinton administration, was the world was going online. We were online, finally. And we were able to use that revolution to get rid of layers of management and sort of middle management in the federal government that were no longer necessary. And that's where that's where many of the, much of the downsizing took place. In the course of that, I learned a couple things, okay? First of all, that the government that we inherited in 1993 was still built for a government of clerks. The civil service was, for many years, a government of clerks. So all the standardization that was inherent in the laws, one exam for everybody, et cetera, was based on the fact that circa 1950, most government workers were busy keeping records. Records of your military service, records of your work history for Social Security, records of this, that, or the other thing. It was, it was a mammoth paper operation. One skill set seemed to work across different agencies, and people, you could build a pretty standard kind of workforce in that government. Of course, the government changed dramatically by the dawn of the 20th century. And by the dawn of the 20th century, we find a government that was dramatically different. It's the most highly educated workforce probably anywhere in the world. 20% of federal workers have a master's degree or higher, and that's compared to 13% in the private sector. And more than half of federal workers have a 4-year college degree. That's compared to 35% in the private sector. In other words, what we've seen is the federal government go from a government of clerks to a government of nuclear physicists, molecular biologists, high-priced lawyers, airline regulation specialists, et cetera, et cetera. It is a different government. And because it's a different government, it needs a different civil service. A civil service that, in fact, and this is very unpopular, pays people more money. And it's particularly politically unpopular to say that you need to pay people more money at the top. Because most of the civil service studies have discovered that in the bottom rungs, civil servants are actually paid more than their equivalents in the private sector. But at the very top, when people are managing trillions of dollars, 100,000 workforces and above, et cetera, the pay differentials are enormous. Surprise, surprise, we get screw-ups. Surprise, surprise, entire agencies run off the tracks. We don't have the talent we need for a modern workforce. And it shows. When in the Clinton administration, we faced a terrible mess in the Internal Revenue Service, which wasted somewhere in the neighborhood of $4 billion trying to modernize its IT systems. Well, they simply did not have the talent to modernize their IT systems. And guess what? They couldn't get people from Microsoft, or Apple was a baby at the time, but Microsoft, they couldn't get people to come in and do it. Frankly, we need to be able to hire. If we're going to be a government that's reviewing drugs, that's buying laser-guided missile systems, that is doing a lot of sophisticated stuff, we need people who frankly are able to manage in those very, very difficult areas. That's tough, okay, because it's politically sort of impossible. It's politically impossible to say to the public, you know, median income in the United States is about $70,000 these days. It's impossible to say to them, you know, you really need to pay the head of the Food and Drug Administration $500,000 a year to be competitive with the CEO of Bayer or any of the, you know, big pharma industries, which frankly they are regulating. So I came out with a sort of despairing feel that basically we did not have the talent at the very top in the civil service that in fact we needed. We see it today in the challenge in hiring cybersecurity experts. In spite of the fact that Congress has given DHS more and more money in cyber, we are still woefully behind as a federal government in cybersecurity, and we can't hire. We simply can't hire the people we need because the private sector, we are not competitive with the private sector. That has led me to feel that we should normalize the civil service. In other words, keep merit protection in place, keep them free from political influence, but in fact, give each agency recruiting flexibilities, private sector compensation, and give them the freedom to pay. The Partnership for Federal Service has advocated this. I think a lot of people have advocated this. We couldn't do it in the Clinton administration. Why couldn't we do something like this? Well, for a very simple reason, and a reason that I believe exists to this day. Congress has no interest in this topic. And those who do have an interest in this topic have an interest from all the wrong angles. So on the left, on the Democratic side, the people who are most interested are people who are interested in protecting every single union advantage they can protect, which isn't really the way forward. On the Republican side, you have people whose sole interest is killing the federal unions and reducing their power or eliminating them altogether. Congress has no middle on this issue. For everybody else, it's not an issue they're all interested in taking up. I know, I tried, And I suspect if I had to do that again today, I'd have the same failure. So what we did in the Clinton administration is we resorted to what we jokingly called our samizdat strategy. Those of you old enough to remember the Cold War will remember that there were these papers in the Cold War that the managers of the government-run industries would circulate among themselves so that they could meet their quotas and actually get things done, even though it was not the way they were supposed to do things. And that's what we did. DOD had been being the 800-pound gorilla of the government, had been particularly successful at getting itself out of all sorts of civil service rules and regulations. And so whenever we found a good precedent, mostly they were from DOD, we just made sure that everybody else knew about it. Consequently, a few years later, I was at Harvard and I read a study by a political scientist who was complaining about the fact that more than 50% of the federal government workforce was now out from under Title V. And I thought, oh, it worked. We did it, okay? We actually got the federal government out of Title V. And basically, agencies have done it by going into their appropriations process quietly, under the radar, saying at places like NIH and the National Cancer Institute, guys, we can't hire molecular biologists this way. We need to do something different. And oftentimes they've gotten them. So that's where I think we need to go. We need to realize that this government is no longer a government of clerks. It does very sophisticated things. And to continue to do those sophisticated things well, it needs a workforce that is competitive with the private sector. Finally, let me just talk a little bit, let me just check the time here. Let me just talk a little bit about outsourcing. Paul Light, who Don mentioned before, has written extensively about this. And as we all know, there is a ton of outsourcing going on in the federal government. In fact, there's so much of it that people can't even really get good numbers. I think it's time for Democrats and Republicans to, first of all, stop viewing outsourcing in ideological terms. For the Republicans, this is absolutely the way to go. For the Democrats, this is absolutely anathema. And frankly, I think we need to have a real debate about what is the language in some of the executive orders. What are inherently governmental functions? What is it that the government should be doing itself, and what is it that should be outsourced competitively to the private sector? We need to have this discussion, because frankly, the outsourcing is now out of control. In some ways, this is related to civil service. People outsource so they can pay more money. They outsource so they can get the talent that they need, particularly in technical and scientific and highly competitive areas that they can't get with civil service salaries. And so that's why outsourcing has become so very, very popular, is that they need to be able to compete for talent. Bottom line is, I think that we have had a very robust period of discussion about the civil service. I think that even in this polarized era, even civil service gets tied up in ideological debates. And it's time to sort of step back and understand that, no, we're not going to have as much government as the Democrats want. And no, we're not going to have as little government as the Republicans want. And maybe we should just focus on having the government that we do have able to operate with high levels of efficiency and intelligence. And with that, thank you very much.
Feel free to sit there if you'd like, or stand, either way. Okay.
We have a clicker working or not? You're going to control it?
I can, there is a clicker on the right button.
The right button. Do I point it at you or at the screen? It's not working. Okay. Good morning. Nice to be here with you. Thanks for inviting me to participate here. I think the notion of, yeah. Okay, so we'll give it a shot. Yeah, the notion of studying the administrative state is really important. I don't think we've paid enough attention to it in the past several years. So I'm glad to see that George Mason and Scalia Law School taken this on. There we go. Okay. Specifically, we're talking about the administration of the administrative state. That's when you typically lose your audience. Administrative state may be esoteric enough. The administration of the administrative state is really getting down in the weeds. But that's what we're about here today, and there's a very important subset of the overall discussion. Most presidential administrations do come into office with an agenda for administrative reform, and the political context is what the public resonates with. Government's too costly, it's inefficient, a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse. We've heard that an awful lot in the last 30, 40 years. It still seems to be there, probably because there's no line item in the budget that identified waste, fraud, and abuse. You can't just cut it. And obviously, the need to modernize the IT systems of today. It was ADP. It was called ADP back in the 80s. We had a hard time finding people or hiring people that could bring that knowledge into the federal government because of the reasons that Elaine and Dawn have cited. We have a very old type system for the intake stream and the compensation, so we couldn't modernize in the 80s, had a very hard time. And these days, IT has just revolutionized how we think, how we organize information, how we collect it, how we share it. And it's an ongoing problem in the federal government. Plus, the need to make government more like the private sector. Good luck with that. The rules of the game are radically different in the public sector than in the private sector. There is no bottom line to manage to. And more importantly, in the public sector, Congress is like your board of directors. And I'd like to know what company could survive with the behavior of a board of directors like we have in Congress these days and have had for at least a couple of decades. What company could survive without a CEO? And look at how many agencies have their senior management even today not approved by Congress through the Senate confirmation process. Hundreds, literally hundreds to this day, third year into the administration. So, more like the private sector, I don't think we're going to get there. Okay, there we go. Don's already covered the Civil Service Reform Act. There's just a couple of points I'd like to highlight from that. OPM was created in the Civil Service Reform Act to supplant the Civil Service Commission, which was by statute at arm's length from the president. So Carter recognized the need for an chief executive of the country to have a direct hand and direct control over the HR, the personnel side of government. So that's why OPM was created. Secondly, the notion of pay for performance comes out of the CSRA, both in the creation of the Senior Executive Service, which was a much more flexible personnel system for senior executives and compensation, and the notion of pay for performance, merit pay for managers was also written to the CSRA. We lost that in 1993. Congress revoked that so that the only pay for performance that's still in statute is for the SES, and it's working reasonably well. the notion of demonstration projects, the need to test out new ways to hire and maintain a workforce, comes out of the CSRA with the authority to create demonstration projects. And they were very important for DoD. Up to 10 could be created. DoD used several of those authorities to test out new systems. And this is in the early 80s. They've survived to this day. And they provide an alternative means to hire, compensate, promote, and maintain that workforce. It was used as the basis, that DoD experience was used as the basis in the Bush administration for the national security personnel system. I'll come back to it in a few minutes. And finally, we had the codification of labor management relations in the federal government for the first time ever in the CSRA. That was Chapter 71 of Title V. And that part of the CSRA is an unmitigated disaster. I'll discuss that more later, and it's relevant to basically the rest of the panels on today's program. Oops. Okay, current state of the civil service. Why are we still talking about reforms? We reformed the civil service in '78 significantly. 40 years later, what's it looking like? Well, the general schedule wasn't touched by the Civil Service Reform Act, and that's the very rigid scheme for classifying positions and compensating positions. It serves that clerical workforce that Elaine was talking about from the 1930s and 40s. It's irrelevant today. We need more flexibility than that is able to provide. The NSPS I referred to did away with that. The unions killed it. So there's a self-interest on the labor side to maintain that rigid schedule, because if you address a problem in one part of it, raise one part of your workforce's salaries, everybody floats up with it. So that's why the general schedule is still in play today. We've got a very cumbersome hiring process, totally inflexible. As Elaine was alluding to, we've got to bring in specialists of various kinds. New occupations crop up in a modern economy. You can't hire those people until you classify those positions, an exercise that takes 6 to 8 years, and then subsequently establish pay schedules corresponding to that. So you just can't keep up with the world. Compensation system's out of whack. We overcompensate some parts of the general schedule, undercompensates many parts of the general schedule. It just isn't working. The accountability system is dysfunctional, totally dysfunctional. The rules for firing someone or taking corrective actions, whether it's performance related on the job or it's conduct related, bad actors, those are in statute thanks to the CSRA, and including the steps in the procedure, and over 40 years it's accreted a lot of barnacles. You just can't move people around very comfortably. Labor management regime, really you get more roadblocks and not just inefficiencies, literally roadblocks. Agencies with operational needs, that stakeouts, for example, in the law enforcement arena, and you've got to negotiate the terms of the job at 2 o'clock in the morning, how far away they must be from a latrine, or the ability to take care of personal needs. All of that's got to be pre-negotiated before. It just doesn't work in certain spheres of federal activity. And finally, these days, the oversight agency, OPM's on the brink of being dissolved. So that's the current state. Now, just to give some context and relevance to the rest of the conference today, I'll go through a few more initiatives of past administrations just so we see what's worked and what hasn't worked. There have been some successes, some miserable failures. The interesting thing is how the same problems keep cropping up, they just don't go away. And one of the reasons, of course, is we're talking about administration of the administrative state. It's difficult to get a lot of interest in that, both politically on the Hill and in the public arena. All right, Clinton administration. I'll go through this very quickly because Elaine already covered most of that. The first thing I wanted to start it with is the partnership councils, bringing the unions to the table. It's the first time we had that done. It was at the national level primarily, rather than in the agencies. Whatever good intentions, it undermined the chain of command tremendously. Unions can't bargain over certain things. It's prohibited by statute in Chapter 71 of Title V. So the way to get around that prohibition is, before the policies are implemented, let's talk about it. Let's bring the unions in. So they're not bargaining, they're just participating in the process of developing your policies. And they can nip certain things in the bud at that level. Now, that works really fine if you're a progressive administration where unions are your allies and you share the same agenda. If you don't share the same agenda, they're of absolutely no help to you while you're formulating policies. In fact, they're going to try to derail you early on. So that's what really was at the heart of the partnership councils, and it worked for the Clinton administrations because the unions were their allies. Reinventing government was a big agenda for the Clinton, and they had a lot of successes in that area. IT reform, IT modernization made a lot of progress in that area, but they were bumping up against the same problems that we had seen in the 80s with the general schedule and the classification systems for bringing in specialists that they needed. GEPRA was a big player. Government Performance and Results Act. It was passed in 1993. It wasn't really implemented in the Clinton years until late in the administration, 98, 99, thereabouts. But that set the groundwork for identifying, doing strategic planning, identifying goals and missions for an agency so that the agency could be held accountable politically, both by the president and by Congress. So that was a big step forward. It happened in the Clinton years. The Bush administration picked up on that fairly well and really drove it home, and were actually managing for 8 years 2 GIPRA results. Significant downsizing of government post-Cold War. About 350,000 jobs cut in defense, from about 1.1 million to 850,000. Or 1.2 million to around 850,000. DOD subsequently cut, after the Clintons, another 100,000 jobs. There are around 750,000 today, so major downsizing. But on the flip side, the non-DOD side actually grew by about 100,000. So the reinvention of government was really reinventing DOD to a new reality post-Cold War, and not so much the rest of government. BRAC, which I didn't put on my slide, Base Realignment and Closure Act, had a great deal to do with the success there. Congress cooperated with the downsizing in DOD, and BRAC realignment was a big driver of that. And then finally, they targeted administrative functions. They had goals of reducing administrative functions by 50% of the employees. And on the OPM side, they abolished the Federal Personnel Manual, which was an accretion of guidance and rules from OPM. It was a shelf full of guidance and rules just in the personnel arena that basically amplified what was in the Code of Federal Regulations. That was a good thing, abolishing that, because it forced agencies to make personnel decisions as they suited their needs, much more so. It was more difficult from a lawyer's side to defend a personnel action in court because you didn't have these volumes of rules to fall back on. But practically speaking, it forced the agencies to be a little more creative in their decision-making process in personnel. So that was a good thing. Next, we step to the Bush administration. So some successes, some failures here. First thing is they abolished the partnership councils that had been created by the Clinton administration to kind of regain the chain of command notion of policy implementation. IT modernization was proceeded at pace, a lot of funding, computer systems, bringing in IT consultants. So that was a burgeoning, and it is to this day. GPRA, the Government Performance and Results Act, OMB was managing the agency's budget submissions according to the quarterly reports that were being submitted on that. It was really good. They did a terrific job. As a result of those scorecards, you were able to, in the agencies, tie employee performance requirements to mission statements and goals of the agency much more directly. So I think that was a boon within the agencies as well, down to the employee level. And then the biggest thing was the biggest innovation was the NSPS, National Security Personnel System. This was a statutory authority that DOD received from Congress that basically tossed out Title V and allowed DOD in conjunction with OPM to create a whole new personnel system. That's the NSPS. And the notions there were to give authorities, hiring authorities directly to DOD, to streamline the recruitment and hiring process, speed it up, and target certain occupations for recruitment purposes as they saw fit. Pay banding, get rid of the general schedule and substituted 3 pay bands to get you up to senior performers and move them through those bands based on performance and not seniority, not time on the job. So that's kind of revolutionary, certainly compared to the general schedule. And the classification system basically was cast aside so that DOD would classify these bands, not individual positions, but bands. Very flexible. The disciplinary grievance process was expedited, cut less than half of the current system, and mostly kept internally in DOD before it got kicked out to MSPB. So the ultimate appeals process stays as it is in chapters 43 and 75 in Title V, meaning MSPB and then subsequently to the courts. But at least the front-end process, a lot more flexible, a lot speedier. And then finally, labor management relations were to be revolutionized. This is in statute, not regulation, not executive order. Unions would be relegated to a consulting role, not a bargaining role. Now, that's all nice. What happened in reality? DOD backed off, even though Congress told them, go ahead and rewrite the labor statute. DOD backed off completely. They did not want to take on the unions. They were more interested in the pay and performance side of NSPS. So they implemented none of the flexibilities that were permitted them. There was some calculation in DOD leadership that perhaps they'll cut a deal with the unions will back off and let them proceed. The unions did not. I spent a year and a half, I and 15 other representatives from DOD, meeting with 20 unions every 3 months, going through the NSPS proposals, assuring them that we are putting aside the labor provisions, separate discussions later, etc. They told us, do what you want. We'll see you in court after you issue the regulations. This is from day one. But we had to go through the charade anyway, and we did. So the union stuff was taken off the table. The rest of it, which was issued in regulations, basically went into effect, I believe it was 2006. The law was passed in 2003. There were sunset provisions in there. There was some need to get this expedited. The unions were playing a waiting game, delay. We were supposed to negotiate with them for 6 months, year and a half. So then again, strategically, DOD decided not to implement the pay provisions and the flexibilities and reforms in any part of the organization that had a bargaining unit. Hence, the unions were not touched. Their employees, their members were not touched by any of these reforms. They still sued in court. And of course, they got at the district court level in DC, they had supportive judges. So there were injunctions put against it. They were finally beaten 2 years later in the Circuit Court of Appeals. But by then, the clock was beginning to run out on the NSPS. So success, partial success, ultimately failed. How did it fail? Obama administration came along. First thing they did was go after the NSPS. And within 6 months, Congress repealed the National Security Personnel System. Gone, history. By the end of that fiscal year, which is 2009, September 2009, NSPS was no more. What else did the Obama administration do? They created what they called forums, a National Labor Management Council and labor management forums in every agency. So now the unions got multiple bites at the policy apple before anything was ever issued. That worked for them for 8 years, but again, they were partners in running government, so that worked out very well for them. The administrative state with union help gets really administrative. All right. As far as anything else on the administrative reform agenda, nothing memorable stays from the Obama years. Don't have much else to say there. So now let's take a look at the Trump administration, a work in progress. We have 3 executive orders that were issued last year in May. The unions immediately went to court and obtained injunctions, as much of the administration's agenda has been tied up in court, immigration, and everything else. However, some portions of the EOs are active. Only certain sections were enjoined. And since each executive order has severability provisions in there, those do go into effect. The first one I list there is an attempt to streamline removal procedures for poor performers and poor conduct actors. The meat of those is basically enjoined, but there are provisions reporting data collection and such like, which will be helpful for additional reforms. Those did go into effect. I guess there's at least one other panel here that's going to cover this, so I won't go into much detail. The one I do want to underscore here is the executive order on collective bargaining agreements, because that one contains a provision which is not enjoined, creating an interagency labor relations working group. And that is long, long overdue. That finally creates in the executive branch a centralized coordinating body that establishes labor management policy from the management side, not the councils that the unions have, but from the management side. This is 40 years late coming, but thank goodness it's happened. It's a great initiative from the administration. It allows agencies to share successes in their dealings with their unions and to advance a management-oriented labor policy in the executive branch. Now, my questions are, and that'll be basically to the panels. What is DOD's response to these executive orders? DOD has 1,200 bargaining units. All the other agencies combined, 300. DOD is the big gorilla in labor relations. DOD, from my experience with the NSPS, has a kind of a pro-union orientation out of necessity. The base commanders, for example, are military officers. They rotate in for a couple of years. They're not looking for labor hassles. They're trying to establish good relations for those 2 years. They don't want to read about themselves in controversies with the unions, who are political agents. So they tend to cave to union demands. So there's very fertile ground here for the unions to maintain an active base of membership within DOD. Leadership and headquarters in DOD is much more sanguine about these relationships, but getting policies, confrontational policies implemented out of the Pentagon, very tough. So I'm interested to hear what DOD's take is on these executive orders, how supportive they are, and how they've proceeded to implement these. OPM, which really is the general in the fight, it is a fight, with the unions, right now is on wobbly, shaky legs. They're waiting for a new director. She's just had her hearing a couple of weeks ago. It may be confirmed this summer. Meanwhile, OMB is just picking OPM apart. So that leadership in this very important area is sorely lacking, and I don't know what the future looks like there. So who will lead that agenda? So finally, let me close with that. The administration's tackling of the union issue is spot on. Unions, as the NSPS example is a perfect example, reforms long overdue were killed even in an area that didn't touch their vital interests. They were just looking downstream that if NSPS succeeded, then their members might want to get into NSPS-like pay systems with more flexibility and more employee orientation than what is currently in the system. That's why they killed it. So tackling the unions is really important, if for no other reason than to get them to change their thinking and start thinking about future and the benefit of their members. These reforms are always accused of being, certainly by the Democrats in Congress, attempts by administrations to politicize the civil service. Take a dose of reality here. The civil service consists of around 2 million people. Political management consists of PASs, board members, heads of agencies, about 350, 400 people. The boards and commissions, about another 300. That's about 700 Senate-confirmed top-level people. You've got about 700 non-career SESers. That's about 1,400 people. About 1,500 Schedule Cs, which are just staff support. They're not even the line managers. That's 3,000 politicals in a system of 2 million employees. 6,000 career executives, 50,000 career managers, and 2 million employees. The political sector represents 0.15% of the workforce. It did in 1980, it did in 1992, it did in 2000, 2008, and it does to this day, 0.15%. Most of those, overwhelmingly, that 0.15% never touches a GS-9, GS-11, GS-13. The notion that they're politicizing that part of the workforce is absurd. And yet, that's the kind of political fight that we're into when we try to administer the administrative state. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of our panelists. We have a few minutes for questions. I would just like to lead off, maybe give you an opportunity to respond to each other with the last point that George made relating to political control. There's something which we haven't really hit head on, which is the normative question here about how much political control there ought to be. So we had, Margaret Weichert testify yesterday, and some of the opposition to the proposed OPM reorganization is the suggestion that you don't want too much White House control, and bringing a lot of these functions to OMB is even more within the White House than OPM, which is already within the White House. And as Don mentioned, the creating OPM was a way to try to bring this into the White House. So it seems like there's some misalignment in the analysis here. So how much of these types of rules ought to be centrally developed, and maybe as a legal matter, should Congress look at revisiting some of these delegations? And maybe if you could also talk about, to the extent that you care to, a little bit more the principal agent problem. There's the president, and he's got his views, but then there are agency heads that might want to get along with whatever their parochial union is. So if you could talk about that kind of suite of issues.
Me?
You want to start, and
I'll start. The notion of breaking up OPM and moving some component of it into the White House, I just don't see as practical at all. The White House isn't organized or structured to get involved in operational matters. Managing the HR system of the federal government has a great deal. Clearly, there are policy aspects of it, but dealing with the agencies on a day-to-day basis, answering questions, providing leadership, making sure executive orders are implemented, those are operational issues. And the White House is clearly not set, it shouldn't be set up for, that's what the cabinet is for. Operations and effectuation of policy is supposed to be through the cabinet and the agencies, not out of the White House. You want the Domestic Policy Council involved in thinking big picture policy and then directing the agencies to execute accordingly. You can't marry the two up in the White House. It just will not work.
I totally agree. I mean, you can't do that. That's kind of ridiculous. And in fact, we had a little example of that right after 9/11 in the Bush White House, when for months and months they resisted the creation of DHS because they wanted to do it under the terrorism czar. And remember, there was one widely publicized press conference that they then made fun of on Saturday Night Live, where poor Tom Ridge was up there basically introducing people from other agencies who actually had the authority and the power and the resources to do things. Tom Ridge himself did not. If you're in the White House, you don't have planes, trains, automobiles, right? That's what, and people, that's what you need to actually do stuff. Secondly, is White House personnel itself is at a crossroads. In this administration, obviously, they've been criticized often for not even putting people in the jobs, let alone getting them through the Senate, but they haven't even filled a lot of these jobs or put nominees in. But there's a bigger problem here, which is that the whole notion of the political leadership assumes that you can find people who have capacity and the right politics at the same time. Well, let me take one of my favorite jobs, the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition. I suspect you know about this job, George. In the Clinton White House, I got a call from a very, very big contributor to the Democratic Party. And he had a very accomplished wife, okay, shall we say. And he wanted her to have that job of Undersecretary for Acquisition. And I said, well, she's a talented woman, but she's not qualified for this job. And he said to me, oh, she can master a briefing book. I said, nobody masters a briefing book in laser physics. Just doesn't happen, or in aeronautic engineering, right? And that's what that job is. You're buying very sophisticated weapon systems. And you don't just learn about it overnight by the staff sort of teaching you these things. That is even at the political level, right? The demand for expertise is getting tougher and tougher and tougher. You can't put a non-scientist, a non-medical person in as the head of the Food and Drug Administration. They're not going to know what the staff is talking about, let alone be able to lead and make reasonable, judgments. So we've got a big problem here, which is the things that the federal government is doing now and which we will, Democrat or Republican, will keep doing in the future, are things which demand high levels of expertise, which we are not able to get in the civil service, and we're not able to get them even at the political level.
All right, well,
Yeah, I may put in 2 cents on that. Why wasn't Elaine director of OPM. Right? That's kind of what I want to know. All right? All right, you're in the White House. You were in White House office, right? I guess, technically. And you just admit you can't do it from there, right?
Right.
And the wonderful person was over there, but wasn't an Elaine Kemmark, all right?
Well, I mean, but that's because the reinventing government process was much, much bigger than just civil service reform. I mean, we did agency reforms in all major cabinet agencies. We did a big FAA reform, which, by the way, is one of the few areas in which Al Gore and Ronald Reagan agreed. We had basically the same FAA reform plan. We weren't successful, but we had the
It
same.
still hasn't been done.
It still hasn't. Oh, no, it still
It's
hasn't.
amazing. That one of
So
the first meetings I had was on that,
Oh, yeah.
and they still haven't
They
done
still
it.
haven't done it. But basically, the project encompassed cross-government. It was a huge project, all right? We had probably 2,000 people working on it at the time. It encompassed the cross-government issues like civil service, budgeting, procurement, and then agency by agency issues, many of which were operational. Let me also talk for a minute about something you raised, George, about running government like a business. That is something that we talked about a lot. Republicans love to talk about it, okay, because that's in their culture. It does make sense, but only at levels of government that the president almost never deals with, okay? So if you are running the Army's motor pool, you can learn a heck of a lot from Avis and Hertz, right? You can learn how to keep those cars clean and running and always ready, et cetera. If you're running a distribution project, you can learn an awful lot from the Disney Corporation or other corporations. In other words, down where the federal government does do operations, it makes perfect sense to partner and learn from the private sector, learn their management techniques, look at their IT systems, et cetera. And we encourage that all the time. But at the level of political appointees, at the policy level, at the White House level, it falls apart. As you mentioned, George, Congress is like the board of directors from hell, okay? It's just so difficult to manage, with Congress as your board of directors, no matter what party you're in. So I don't want to throw out the run government like a business, because it does matter at certain things, but you got to think of it in common sense ways. My favorite counterexample is the Office of Policy Planning at the State Department. Office of Policy Planning is an important and very prestigious office. George Kennan was there when he planned out the Cold War. This is where people think great thoughts and try to put America in the world and in the future of the world. What other place in the private sector has a job like that? Okay? Nobody does. Okay? There's nothing really analogous. So there's tons and tons of stuff in the federal government that just doesn't fit into this business, but there are things that do. So we should be a little discerning on that.
All right. So,
But the point is the management part. Yes, at the if somebody's doing, but the management cannot be done. If I read one book, Ludwig von Mises, the title is Bureaucracy, all right? It explains why they're fundamentally different and they can't be run the same way. And they're right, it's mostly Republicans that are wrong on this. But the point I made with you, I'm just going to do one more. The point I was making was not put you on the thing about the White House, but even George, he and I are closer than anybody. I mean, you talk about the White House and OMB. The OMB is not the White House, all right? We've got to distinguish between the White House office, which is the White House, and OMB, which is not. OMB is separate from the White House, and they have separate interests. The OMB is basically the unions for the managers in the government, all right? It is a kind of union operation that represents a constituency, the professional managers of the government. And that's why the OPM thing is preposterous, to bring it not into the White House, which I would have a much less objection to if it went into the White House office, but to put it into OMB is to put it in the hands of the people who are part of the problem. I mean, to me, it makes no sense at all what they're trying to do. And this isn't anti-Trump, 'cause I guarantee you he knows nothing about what this is going on. Carter, who is a fanatic on this stuff, when he came down on the day to sign it, and Scotty Campbell and I got to be friends at the end, he told me, Carter was famous about even running who was going to be on the White House tennis courts. He read the whole thing the night before, and he came down, and Scotty said, well, what do you think of it? He said, really boring stuff, isn't it? All right? Now, he was the president most interested in running the bureaucracy. All right? That's the problem. Go ahead.
That very cheerful note, we're going to take about a 10-minute break until we go to our next panel. So thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our panelists.